for the day.
The way we announce events now.
This is gonna be at the,
Recording
on the
All right, so it's 5:30, so we're gonna get started. Thank you all for joining us for our second in-person graduate student speaker event in 2 years and our last one for this semester. My name is Kara Flynn and I am the Education and Engagement Activist here in Special Collections. And the Special Collections Graduate Student Speaker Series began in 2018 and is presented in partnership with the Graduate School and International Education. The goal of this series is to provide graduate students who conducted research in special collections with a forum in which to present that research and an opportunity to gain experience in public speaking. I would thank Kelsey, the library's PR director, and Laura Moy, director of graduate student support, for helping us to promote the series each semester. So today we will be hearing from Rachel Whitaker, a PhD candidate in the history department at the University of Arkansas. She is also the research specialist at Shiloh Museum of Ozark History and an adjunct history instructor at Connors State College in Warner, Oklahoma. Her current research focuses on the timber and railroad industry in Pedigree, Arkansas, the self-proclaimed hardwood capital of the world. Tonight she will share with us her research into J.H Phipps and the Northwest Arkansas timber industry. The J.H Phipps Lumber Company operated along the Frisco Railroad during the height of the Arkansas Ozark timber boom, and special collections materials related to Phipps include land records, lease agreements, and company budgets. So since I probably don't need to say this to this group since we're all masked, but since this is our only our second in-person event in special collections in this new world, we're still getting back into the swing of things, and our events might look a little bit different than they did before the pandemic. So if you would like to partake at the end of the presentation tonight, feel free to grab and go pre-packaged snack on your way out, or a bottle of water. And we do encourage wearing masks. So thank you all for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Rachel.
Thank you, Kara. So normally when I do public speaking, I talk about moonshine, I talk about outhouses, I talk about whorehouses, I talk about all of these really random topics. So this is going to be a little different talk for me tonight. It's a little more serious, a little more economic, and detailed than what I normally do. So bear with me. I apologize. I think most of us have seen the meme where the guy is connecting all of the conspiracies. Originally a scene from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, this meme was especially popular in the last few years. And it kept coming to mind when I was tracking down the little tidbits about J.H. Phipps and seeing who all he was connected to and what he was involved in. To be perfectly honest, I started off thinking he was just some guy with a small sawmill briefly in St. Paul, and then one in Pedigree, and eventually one in Fayetteville. I had no idea just how influential he was and his business partners were, and just how far his reach was. I also had to dig through a lot of misinformation, which seems to be the theme of my larger project for my dissertation. The history of the timber industry and railroads in Northwest Arkansas was recorded. It's not some great state secret. The businessmen involved kept ledgers, they filed deeds, they wrote documents of incorporation, and even had regular business meetings where they kept minutes. Notifications for their dealings appeared not only in local papers, but also in the Arkansas Gazette. But a lot of the previous scholarship focused largely, I believe, on the oral histories of the area. And I love oral histories, and I don't want to snub them in any way, but people's memories fail, especially when they're questioned 40 or more years after the fact, or if grandchildren are asked about stories they heard from their grandparents. Eventually, the history becomes murky and muddled and sometimes just completely wrong. Or sometimes, in some of the instances I'm finding, the families deliberately change the narrative to cover some kind of sin in the past. I think some of the scholarship was also biased by this notion that the Ozarks were an isolated region and that the men and women who lived here had to be ignorant barefoot hillbillies who wanted to avoid the changes taking place around them in the lowlands. These scholars saw progressive technologies as an invasion from the outside and not something the people here willingly brought upon themselves. Clifton Hall writes a lot about railroads, and he especially uses this hillbilly stereotype for his discussion of the rails in Northwest Arkansas as it pushed into Madison County. More importantly, some of the scholarship did not have the benefit of the internet and the sheer luck that I had of coming along after some very important families and corporations left their documents to archives. Sadly, much of the previous recorded history has been repeated though over and over and over and now has become gospel. So what I'm trying to do is kind of set the record straight just a little bit. So let's take a look at J.H. Phipps and see what damage we can undo. We'll do largely chronologically, so you can see the highs and lows as they played out in his lifetime. I'll try to provide visuals to help with the numbers I'm going to throw at you because there are a lot of numbers that I found. So don't worry about getting lost. There will be visuals. James Henry Phipps was born the 5th of January, 1869 in Missouri to Ambrose E. Phipps and Frances Fanny Mills Phipps. Ambrose and Fanny were married in March 1859 in Shelby County, Illinois, and moved with their growing family to Missouri sometime after 1865, but before 1870. Veteran records show that later in life, at least, Ambrose suffered from rheumatoid arthritis, and he began collecting his pension in 1890. Ambrose and Fanny had 7 children that appear in the census records: Mary, Charles, James, Samuel, Jesse, Albert, and Arthur. All of the siblings seem to have lived long lives except for Samuel and Mary. And Samuel may just have gotten lost more because of that 1890 census being lost, and it's hard to track people when you lose them there. But Mary is lost after the 1860 census, so presumably she dies. Ambrose was a farmer who seemed to do relatively well for himself. His property value is always enumerated in the census. In 1870, the Ambrose Phipps family lives in Union Township in Putnam County, Missouri, near the Iowa state line. Nearby are Ambrose's father, Samuel, and his brother, Jesse, and their families. We know from the census that Ambrose can read and write, and his personal property is valued at approximately $100. In his household are Francis Charles, age 3, and James, age 1. In 1880, the family was moved to Bowman Township in Sullivan County, Missouri, and here James Henry attended school, but there are no other Phipps family on the same page at the census, so if they moved there at least around the time of the census, there's no other Phipps family right nearby. However, I did find the land grants, and I did find that in 1877, it doesn't show up here, the highlighted sections. This is Ambrose, and this is his brother, right next to each other. So they both had 40 acres nearby. And it's here in Sullivan County, Missouri, where Ambrose and Fanny will remain until their deaths. A photo published in the Northwest Arkansas Times on the 14th of June, 1960 was accompanied by this caption, time for a photo. Workers at the old Phipps lumber mill in St. Paul worked to look at the birdie and get their picture taken. J.H. Phipps went to St. Paul as a railway agent for the Frisco. He started the J.H. Phipps Lumber Company in partnership with J.M. Williams. In 1898, they moved their headquarters to Fayetteville, and this was the beginning of what is now the Fulbright Wood Products Company. You're going to hear more about the Fulbright family later, but Phipps's origins in Northwest Arkansas is actually our first mystery. Madison County's courthouse burned at the turn of the century, and so much of the legal records prior to 1900 was lost. There are some land records with the Phipps Lumber Company name on them, and even some with the individual Phipps brothers' names on them. but tracking down the earliest dates is difficult, even why he came here is a little bit muddled. This 1960 article would have us believe he came as an agent for the Frisco Railroad. This appears in multiple sources that kept getting repeated over and over and over. But Clifton Hull, author of multiple books and articles on the railroad industry, claims that James Henry Phipps was actually a lumberjack who arrived in Madison County and soon started the Phipps Lumber Company, which he claimed was the largest in Northwest Arkansas. A marriage certificate suggests that Phipps arrived sometime before the 11th of January, 1893. On that date, he and Cora J. Kelly, both of Madison County, Arkansas, applied for a marriage license. They were married on the 18th of January. On the 13th of January, 1899, the Springdale News reprinted a notice from the St. Paul Mountaineer, letting the people in the area know that J.H. Phipps and William McCoy of Pedigree had created Denton Lumber Company. The Mountaineer editor assured their readers that both men were experienced millmen and bound to succeed. It should be noted that in 1900, James H. Phipps, lumberman, still lived in St. Paul, Kilburn Township of Madison County, Arkansas. From the census, we know that he could read and write, he owned his own home freely, and that it was a house, not a farm. So his interest in the timber industry here is strictly as a businessman and not as a farmer, supplementing his income. In his home are his wife, Cora, and his children, Vida, 5, and there's a child listed as Herbal, who's 4, but I think it's actually Orville. I find him later. This is his Orville, Harry, who's 2, and his brother, Albert, who's 25. On the 11th of December, 1900, the Arkansas Gazette reported that the James H. Phipps Company had incorporated at St. Paul with a capital investment of $25,000. James H. Phipps was the president, J.M. Williams was the vice president, and W.J. Reynolds was both secretary and treasurer. Board meeting books for the J.H. Phipps Lumber Company can be found in the Fulbright family papers here in special collections. The opening meeting was held the 6th of December, 1900. The J.H. Phipps, J.M. Williams, and W.J. Reynolds listed as each having 1,000 shares and thus 1,000 votes on any and all business matters. The early board meetings read like 3 dudes chilling in the office of the J.H. Phipps Lumber Company in St. Paul. Probably, this is me speculating, but probably the cigars, maybe some alcohol, maybe avoiding their wives and writing some stuff down according to Robert's Rules of Order, but not really reporting what that business was. They just said they talked about business. And if there were any other stockholders in attendance, there's no indication in the minutes. They did develop their bylaws with 10 conditions in one of the later meetings. The first condition was meetings were required to be held in the company offices at St. Paul. The meetings were held on the first Monday in January at 7 p.m. And at that time, they could elect officers. This implies that they already had several locations and or that they expected to grow. Number 2, monthly meetings were also held at the St. Paul company offices on the first Monday of the month at 7:30 p.m. with special meetings called as needed by the president or 3 of the board of directors. The implications here being that they didn't expect the annual meeting to go more than 30 minutes or that they would forego the January meeting in favor of the annual shareholders meeting. And it actually seems like those meetings were short because in some of the later years, they do back-to-back meetings every minutes. Number 3, the board elected the officers. 4, a meeting required 3 board members to make a quorum. 5, the president's job was to preside over the meetings. Seems kind of obvious, but number 6, the vice president's job was to take the president's place if he was not available for the meeting. 7, the treasurer's job was to execute a bond for the company at a reputable trust or securities company for the amount of $5,000, and the secretary, he would be required to attend all meetings. Number 8, the secretary slash treasurer was required to perform any and all duties at any time at the discretion of the board and the president. I don't think I would want this job. Number 9, the transfer of stock could only be done in person and at the discretion of the board. And number 10, the vice president was instructed to keep the property of the company, including the merchandise, and also to get insurance for it. You guys can see the meeting minutes here. This is literally what they would say. Reading of the minutes of the meeting after this until July of 1901, we're like, yeah, we held a meeting, we discussed some stuff, and so made a motion to adjourn the meeting. It was seconded, and so we left. The minutes to this point are at most a few lines, and then on the 6th of January 1901, there was stock transferred to J.H Phipps. The monotony of brief lines resumes until the December 1902 meeting, when new people appear and it seems the company actually changes hands. Assets were assessed at $51,400 and they were sold for $50,000 to J.H Phipps, J.M. Williams, W.G. McCoy, S.L. Gill, and W.J. Ritchie. We know that about the same time, the Arkansas Gazette published a notice that Phipps Lumber Company of St. Paul had filed papers of a corporation with the Secretary of State, and that they had a capital investment of $50,000, doubling their value from the $25,000 in December of 1900. In 1903, the J.H Phipps Lumber Company holds their first meeting at Fayetteville. And in 1904, we see J.H Phipps filing his first deed in Washington County, Arkansas. In the same year, he expanded, adding a planing mill and other machines for the construction of wagons. And this made the newspaper so excited. So in January 1907, J.H Phipps still holds 750 shares for his company, and J.M. Williams likewise. S.L. Gill and W.J. Reynolds each hold 250, and the company is valued at $162,292.86. In April of 1907, the Secretary of State approved the organization and incorporation of the Citizens Bank of Pedigree for $10,000 capital. 100 shares were issued at $25 each. The stockholders were Bruce Holcomb, who was the president, Eli Sizemore, who was vice president, C.C. Drake was secretary treasurer, and the non-office holding board of directors were J.H Phipps, A.A. Grigsby, W.J. Ritchie, and R.E. Cornett. And these stock certificates and books are held at Shiloh. January 1908 shareholders meeting, the Phipps Lumber Company reported $199,894.71 in assets and the same in liabilities, with $85.90 cash on hand. And the list of assets and the list of liabilities would include things like what property they held, who owed them money, how much they owed someplace else, or later it'll show the depreciation of value on equipment. The following year reported J.H Phipps and J.M. Williams each held 1,125 shares of the company stock. S.L. Gill and W.J. Reynolds held 375 each. W. Elmore and Mrs. Hunter held 50 shares apiece, and Miss Reynolds held 15 shares. W.J. Reynolds served as the proxy for Mrs. Hunter and Miss Reynolds, as presumably a shareholders meeting was no place for ladies. At this meeting, the company reported $154,380.45 in assets and the same in liabilities, with $360.97 in cash in the bank. In the summer of 1909, the company purchased the Phipps Brothers sawmill at Patrick in Madison County for what the brothers owed in debt, and just a little bit more. In 1910, J.H Phipps appears in the 1910 census in Fayetteville, living on North College Avenue. His occupation is listed as a proprietor of a lumber company, and he is listed as an employer and not just working on his own account. He owns his own home freely. Living with him are his wife Cora, their children Vida, Erbil, Harvey, Doyle, Virginia, Velma, and his mother Frances. Orville, while attending school as any 13-year-old should, also labored at the lumber company with his father. Among the Phipps neighbors are the Cravens, Stones, and Grays. So if you're not familiar with the people themselves, you might be familiar with the landmarks named for them here in Fayetteville. Also in 1910, the Ozarks Opera House Company formed in Fayetteville, and on the board of directors were J.M. Williams, J.H. Phipps, Al Simcoe, Dr. J.P. Height, C.O. Hansard, and W.W. Chapman. In 1911, the Phipps Lumber Company increased their capital stock to $250,000, 10 times their value in 1900. And this is where it gets interesting to me, sound railroads interesting. In 1912, the board meeting minutes take on a new detailed turn. The J.H. Phipps and J.M. Williams were authorized by the company to purchase timberlands from the Frisco Railroads as individuals using company funds because the railroad refused to sell timberlands to corporations. Once the two men had completed the purchases, they were expected to transfer the deed to Phipps Lumber Company. And in March of 1913, they had secured 3 deeds from the railroad. In April of 1913, the shareholders received word that an engineer named Sheaver had completed 8 miles of railroad track for the company. In May, J.H. Phipps had been authorized by the company to sign any stipulations set by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Forest Service for railroad construction. At the meeting held in August, F.R. Wood proposed that Cass be the terminus for the railroad under construction. And on the 29th of August, the Arkansas Gazette published an amendment to the company charter. They had filed notice that week with Earl W. Hodges, Secretary of State, that the Phipps Lumber Company intended to build and maintain railroads now that they had over 11 miles of track actually completed. In August of 1914, a discussion was held about the extension of the railroad over a gorge, and it was agreed that a 3rd bridge should be built on the line to access more timber. In December of 1914, a bond was issued for the Black Mountain and Eastern Railroad for $75,000 divided by sets worth $5,000, and each set of $5,000 would be liquidated each year for the following 15 years, at which time the full bond would be paid. At the first meeting in 1915, the shareholders meeting, the capital of the company had increased to over $400,000 by adding the railroads. In January, the Arkansas Gazette published notice that the Black Mountain and Eastern Railroad had been established with a capital stock of over $250,000. The charter for the railroad had been approved by the State Board of Railroad Incorporation on the 22nd of January, 1915. The notice published stated that there were approximately 20 miles of track from Combs in Madison County, Arkansas, to Cass in Franklin County, Arkansas. Board of directors for the railroad was Ed E. Jeter of Combs, Jesse Phipps of St. Paul, J.H. Phipps, J.M. Williams, and W.J. Reynolds of Fayetteville. In January of 1916, J. Fulbright had 177 shares of stock in the Phipps Lumber Company and is added quickly to the board of annual shareholders meetings. The following month, the regular meeting, Jay is made the vice president of the company. May of 1916, the Arkansas Gazette notified readers of the organization and incorporation of the Oklahoma Land and Timber Company of Fayetteville with $10,000 capital. Serving on the board for this company are J. Fulbright, I.P. Jones, J.H. Phipps, and W.W. Woods. In August of the same year, the Black Mountain Eastern Railroad notified the public of its intention to change its name to the Combs, Cass, and Eastern Railroad, with James H. Phipps as the president, Ed E. Jeter as its vice president, and Jesse Phipps, W.B. Woods, and W.J. Reynolds on its board. And here I'm going to deviate just a little bit from the chronology. I'm really hoping Dr. Woods would be here because I have so many questions for him about the Fulbrights. But the Fulbrights also play a little bit of part in the misinformation about the tale of J.H. Phipps. There's one book written about the matriarch of the clan, Roberta, and then there is a much more accurate work written by Dr. Randall Woods. And let me start with Roberta's version of the events. According to Roberta's biographers, J. Fulbright, and I'm going to refer to him as J because if I say Fulbright, most people think it's the senator. So J bought a bank in Fayetteville and soon after was involved in the operation of Fulbright Wholesale Grocery, Ozark Poultry and Egg Company, Crystal Ice Company, Fayetteville Mercantile Company, Phipps Lumber Company, Washington Hotel, Democrat Publishing. You get the point. He's involved in a lot of different things. He's also involved in things in Stillwell, Oklahoma. And in 1916, according to Roberta, he purchases the Combs, Cass, and Eastern Railroad. Eventually, the family also bought into a Coca-Cola franchise. And this work written by Dorothy Stuck and Nan Snow focuses on how Roberta overcame such a devastating poor background to become such an influential woman in Fayetteville. It focuses on the contributions of the Fulbrights to the community of Fayetteville, almost if in some ways they single-handedly as a family brought the backwater of Fayetteville into the modern era. Dr. Woods is a little more pragmatic in his approach, and even submits in his introduction to his reader that much of what he got from the interviews with Senator Fulbright were later in the senator's life and largely repetitive of what was already in print. The Fulbrights, according to Dr. Woods, arrived in Fayetteville in 1906. Population in that time was about 3,000, and Jay moved his family into Arkansas looking for natural resources ripe for harvesting and also for his next opportunity, probably with no expectation of staying here. In fact, he had planned to move them to Memphis and got sidetracked by Fayetteville and some family connections here. When the Fulbrights became involved in the Phipps Lumber Company, it employed over 200 people. And according to family lore in both Roberta's book and Dr. Woods, Jay purchased controlling stock in 1917 so that, of the Phipps Lumber Company so that he would not have to foreclose on the business. But in 1916, Jay still has not purchased the CC&E, nor is the Phipps Lumber Company reporting any devastating losses to the point where Fulbright should have to fear foreclosing. We do see, however, in December of 1917, likely due to Jay's influence, discussion of depreciation and losses of the Phipps Lumber Company. He is a banker and a businessman after all. And this mention in December of 1917 is only that the company began investigating the value of the equipment and how it's depreciated over time. In January of 1918, J. Fulbright was elected president of the company, but J.H. Phipps remains vice president. Here in December of 1918, the first book of J.H. Phipps Lumber Company ends. The Arkansas Gazette reported in September 1918 that the Combs, Cass, and Eastern had reduced its stock from $250,000 to $40,000, but the bond was fully paid. A second book picks back up in 1919, largely with the annual shareholder information showing a balanced assets and liabilities line and the members of the board. Kind of like those early pages in the original. Shiloh Museum holds the Charles Crawford papers, and Charles Crawford was the president of the Citizens Bank of St. Paul and the cashier at the Citizens Bank of Pedigree. He also owned a stave mill in Pedigree, among other things. And the records he maintained and that were preserved was an inspector's report from the Frisco Railroad. Charles Crawford stave mill of Pedigree sent in December of 1919 in car number 422808 6,304 feet of wood to J.H. Phipps Lumber Company in Fayetteville. Another report from August of the same year, found in another box of the collection, says that Crawford and his agent, Robert Young, sent to Phipps Lumber Company pitch axles, oak poles, hickory pins, handles, bolsters, oak rims, double trees, and other items for wagon production. So all the claims that Phipps and Springfield Wagon are making their own items is a little bit debunked here because we have receipts and inspections of items shipped out of Pedigree to these companies already manufactured. Sorry, so many numbers. December of 1920, the company shows both assets and liabilities as $406,800.23. And the following January, J. Fulbright has controlling stock with 1,541 shares, and Phipps only has 416 shares. We still see S.L. Gill and W.J. Reynolds, but their holdings have greatly diminished, with Gill only having 1 share. Eddie Jeter is also appointed superintendent of mills, showing Jay has decided to restructure the operations of the Phipps Lumber Company. In December of 1921, under J. Fulbright, we see the first major decrease in assets for the company since adding the railroad, but this is likely because they're actually checking for depreciation, they're actually balancing the books. They had started the year at $406,823 or $800.23. But in December, when they calculated the annual numbers, they had $379,252.85. It was, however, $1,038.94 in the bank. The railroad had increased its value to $83,970.26. And they had other land holdings that were valued at $46,431 or $46,431.02. While Phipps is no longer president of the company, in 1920 he's gone when the census takers arrived, and his neighbors on Maple Street report for him, and they still claim he is the president of Phipps Lumber Company. J. Fulbright died the 23rd of July, 1923. 2 weeks later at the monthly meeting, J.G. Waugh Jr. nominated Jack Fulbright, Jay's eldest son, to finish out his term as president of the Phipps Lumber Company, since the Fulbright estate owned so many shares. The motion carried unanimously, and Jack signed off as president on the meeting minutes. In December of 1923, the company continues to decline with assets and liabilities adding up to $367,233.75. There was even less cash in the bank, with only a total of $260.89. And the sales from the year, however, are reported for the first time with a total of $300,774.02. So while the company is no longer in an upward trajectory, perhaps padded by the optimism of its original board and leadership, it still does not seem to be operating in the red. Following Jay's death, all mention of Phipps disappears from the record, even though his name will remain on the company for a few more decades. In June of 1925, the CC&E petitioned the government to remove 12 miles of tracks. The line is still owned, not by the Fulbrights alone, but by the Phipps Lumber Company and its shareholders. And at this time, the line was evaluated prior to a ruling about whether or not they could remove the track, and it was determined that the railroad had about 17 miles in total and was worth $37,661. In January of 1926, Roberta represents her husband's estate, and it's 1,907.5 shares of Phipps Lumber Company. Roberta herself holds 151.5 shares. Jack has 50. Anna Fulbright Teasdale has 25. J.W., the future senator, holds 25. F.N. Gray holds 1. And Fayetteville Mercantile Company, represented by F.N. Gray, holds 27. Jack, F.N. Gray, W.B. Wood, Robert, and Anna are voted as the new board of directors. Deeds held by the Fulbrights on behalf of the J.H. Phipps Lumber Company at the end included land in Washington County, Madison County, Franklin County, and Johnson County. Phipps in 1930, according to the U.S. Census, was still president of the Phipps Lumber Company. He's holding on to that. He had moved back to North College Avenue, now living at 325 North College with his wife Cora, his daughter Virginia, now age 24, who worked for the U.S. Census Office, and his grandson James C. Eason, the son of his deceased daughter Vida. His neighbors are the Jernigans, the Highsmiths, Dixons, and Tillmans. His home is worth $12,000, which is about $195,000 today. Cora died in 1931 and was buried in Evergreen Cemetery. Also in 1931, a grand jury convened to review the failure of the St. Paul and Pedigree banks. According to the 12th of March, 1931 Madison County record, the results of the hearing were kept secret, but of course, being a small community, rumors abounded about who was going to be held responsible and what their fates were going to be. And on the 26th of March, Charles E. Crawford was indicted and in September was found guilty. He was sentenced to 1 year in the state penitentiary, but received a 60-day furlough to help with further investigations to who else was guilty. On the 17th of March, 1932, James Henry Phipps, director of the bank at St. Paul, was indicted on charges for accepting a deposit after the bank had been closed by the state, and a warrant was issued for his arrest. This time in my research, I still have not found whether or not Phipps served any time for his role in continuing the bank even after it closed. Phipps eventually remarried Mary E. formerly Johnson of Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and took in her daughter Anna Johnson. In the 1940 census, James H. Phipps is listed as a salesman for a wholesale lumber company. He has an 8th grade education. His wife has a high school education. They lived at 514 North College. And in January of 1942, J.H. Phipps fell on a patch of ice outside his house and broke his hip. It made front page news of the Northwest Arkansas Times. In February, the paper publishes an update when Phipps's daughter comes to visit. We find him still in the hospital after his fall at the end of February. And in March of the same year, Roberta Fulbright publishes a revised history of the Phipps and Springfield wagon companies in her As I See It column. When reading other materials, the Springfield Wagon Company was taken over by the Fulbrights and the headquarters moved to Fayetteville. But according to Roberta, they were selected as the heirs to the legacy of Springfield Wagon Company. And in April of 1938, high winds were blamed for a fire at the Phipps Lumber Company. So we keep seeing them popping up in the newspaper, but Phipps himself is seldom associated. On the front page of the paper on the 16th of March, amidst World War II and other major news, reads, "Stroke proves fatal to J.H. Phipps." It's political, admittedly, but you also have Germans and Japanese and World War II happening. So, J.H. Phipps, one of the founders of Phipps Lumber Company and widely known in this area, died about noon today at City Hospital after he suffered a stroke this morning. He was stricken while en route to Harrison with Mrs. Phipps. He has been in the lumber business here for the past 50 years. He is survived by his wife, 2 sons and 2 daughters, and 2 brothers. His obituary, published the following day, also adds that he was a member of the Washington Lodge No. 1, the Baldwin Commandery at Fayetteville, and a member of the Scottish Rite and Sahara Temple at Pine Bluff. He had 12 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. Even after what seemed like an odd takeover of his company, J.H. Phipps was remembered by Roberta Fulbright in the following days. Even if later she wanted the greater legacy to be a saving of the company to go to her husband and her son. But she does give him credit over the next few days in the newspaper. And at the time of his death, Phipps owns his own home. He's still working in 1940. Before his fall, 50 hours a week at 71 years old for the lumber company, so he's still involved. But the company he built with his partners had holdings in 4 counties in northwest Arkansas. They built their own railroad to extract timber and carry it to market. And unlike a lot of the other railroads of the period, this railroad, while taking losses at the end of its life, really and truly seemed to be fully funded and paid for in its heyday of the timber boom. Phipps himself was connected with some of the biggest names in Fayetteville business at the time and lived among what was considered the elite of the community. This is no common laborer who just operated a couple of sawmills at the height of the timber boom, and instead was a well-connected businessman who saw the potential of the region and capitalized on it. While it does seem that the Fulbrights may have taken over his dream and much of what he'd worked his life for, he by no means was destitute at the time of his death, nor does it seem like it was a hostile and desperate takeover as they would have had us believe in those 2 books. And unlike Hull and some of the other scholars would have us believe, this modernization was an internal process, not an external imposition. Phipps and his partners did not come here to strip the region of its natural resources of need, but instead contributed to building businesses and banks that would benefit them, but also the community that they lived in. They made their homes here and were part of the community. They weren't just faceless outsiders who disappeared once their business interests began to turn or once the timber was depleted. So I would like to thank Special Collections for the opportunity to access the Fulbright and Wilson collections and to share this material with you guys today. I'd also like to thank Kara for organizing all of this. And I will try and answer questions, but I will warn you that there still are a lot of gaps about J.H. Phipps. I still need to get into the Washington County Archives to access some of the legal records there. But if you guys have any questions or if there's any there, I will. Yes, sir.
So this notion that lumber companies came to establish identity roots runs counter to most of the stuff I know about. You just come, you cut, you leave.
Right.
Do you think this is unique to the Ozarks, or do you think that historians of timber have misunderstood?
So I've actually found one other one, and I can't tell you off the top of my head, but in my historiography that I'm reading right now, there is one other instance. And it is still in the Ozarks, but it's more in Missouri. So it may just be the Ozarks that this is happening. But there are a couple of other instances, even in farther up north in like Wisconsin, and even out into Washington, but in those instances, most of the time they found wives, they found made connections in the community, and that may be the difference. And maybe that's what happened with Phipps and some of the others is they find wives, they find family, they find connections here, and they settle. But they start to succeed for a long time, and they stick around, and they build a community.
Would it be difference in softwood and hardwood?
I don't know, because they're doing both here and
Okay.
and they're doing both in Wisconsin in a couple of books that I've read. So I don't know. But a lot of what you're talking about traditionally think of as these eastern timber barons who they deplete all of the timber they've got access to on the eastern seaboard. They move into Wisconsin, they move farther west, and then they may move over into Washington and Oregon and down into California, or at a certain point, the South opens up and they move into the South with the railroad access, and you start seeing that. So far in Pedigree, I found one northern company, and really quickly they sell out to a local guy. And they don't stick around.
So how reliant were other companies on the rail line? It's like out there? Was it just for their work, or were they actually for other, other mills?
The Combs Pass and Eastern.
Mm.
So the Combs Pass and Eastern was owned by Phipps, but other people were using it. The,
So I was wondering where the profits generated.
right, so, and also the Fayetteville and Little Rock is Fulbrights and some of these other guys that I mentioned. Hugh McDaniel and some of these other guys that are involved in this timber industry in Madison County, specifically St. Paul and Pedigree. And so they build the line, the Fayetteville and Little Rock, that runs from Fayetteville to St. Paul. So it's not that unusual. They kind of set the precedent, and then it comes Cass and Eastern. And then you also have the spoke plant, tram. And so they're all kind of connected anyhow. And they're all partners and working together when you start looking into the stuff. But they're also taking passengers.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard accounts of passengers taking that line down. to
Yeah.
St. Paul and Pedigree before. And I wasn't sure if it was on the same line, if it was on parallel line.
Yeah, so they do both. And there's also another line that they built that went on to Westville, Oklahoma, that you could pick up and go.
Cutting the national forest.
Mostly it's private lands, as far as the deeds that I found. They are getting permission to run the railroad through, because once you get into Franklin County, you're getting into the timber that's the national forest. But around Pedigree and St. Paul and all of that, it's private land. And in the Fulbright papers, family papers, and the J.H Phipps lumber company stuff that's there, you'll see deeds, timber deeds, where the property actually is still owned by the family, but they're getting permission to come in and cut the timber off and clear cut, and or cut only certain portions of it, because some of the families wouldn't even let them clear cut. But it's mostly private land. Or land they got from the railroads.
Forestry.
They run out of trees.
Yeah, they did a lot of deforestation, and I haven't found anything yet that says that they have a practice of replanting, but I know the Forest Service at this point is starting to push for that. And they're handing out pamphlets, and they're going and they're talking to the timber companies at this point. But I haven't found any of that like maintained in their records to say that yes, they're doing that. So mostly they just move on to the next piece of property.
Well, are they selling the land after they cut it?
A lot of it, yeah. Yeah. Clear it and somebody come and put a farm on it.
And it turns back on something that Dr. said about, if there's other situations with communities in Arkansas, in the surrounding area, where there's more permanence there. You know, I think in southern Arkansas, where it's all pine, but pine is generational.
Right.
It comes back. So I wonder what the comparison there is to like something like the Nelson Fall
Right.
down there, where you have pine trees that are cut in 4 years.
Right.
Pine trees cut.
And in southern Arkansas, you have a handful of families that are there for generations, but they also are diversifying what they're doing. They're not just doing timber. They're getting into canning, they're getting into a lot of other things. When you
Paper
start with,
mills.
paper mills. So they, in order to maintain that generational process, they're having to diversify what they're doing. And when you look at, I drove up to Eau Claire and got into the University of Wisconsin records, and there's a set of records for the Ozark Timber Company, which is actually out of Wisconsin. And that's a lot of what they were doing, was they were diversifying. So they weren't just a timber company, they were involved in a lot of other things. And that's why they managed to stick around as long as they did.
I'm sorry, in Louisiana, in South Arkansas, there were timber workers joined unions, many of which were sort of syndicalist, radical unions. Is there any evidence of that in the others?
Yeah, I'm reading articles about injuries and all kinds of things, and there's no uprising, there's no like backlash. It's just, oh, somebody got hurt. So sad. But there's no, we need to change this. There's no agitation to fix that. Now there are some railroad, like the railroad strikes. There is some implications there, but not as far as the injuries. One of the guys, it's a cant hook. He's pulling a log at the sawmill. It's a cant hook. While he's pulling the log, and it goes right across. Yeah. Graphic. I won't go into details, but anyhow, and the doctors say may survive, and like you follow the story, and they report on the guy and his welfare, but there's no agitation for any standards or any unionization or.
I wonder how much of this goes back to the outside ownership.
Right. Well, and these guys are local guys, or
Yeah.
they're part of the community. When you start looking at the ledgers, a lot of that stuff that I was seeing in there was like the liabilities and assets. It was how much they were owed money. I think once the Fulbrights, that's why that number changed a little bit, was I think the Fulbright started making people pay instead of letting them owe a little more. And whereas Phipps and some of these other guys were like, hey, we'll carry you a little bit longer, a little more of a good old boy system. And I think that goes towards a little bit of goodwill in the community, and maybe even with some of the employees. And it also, employed over 200 people in the community. That's major when your population is only 3,000, a little over 3,000.
That's at a peak, right? So what's like population peaks and declines for like the Pedigree, St. Paul?
Oh, Pedigree and St. Paul never get that big.
Yeah,
That's Fayetteville. But Pedigree and St. Paul, a few hundred is all they ever have. But like when you're looking at the census records, it's not really the census records where you see that they're working for the timber industry. There's only a handful of people who are working for the timber industry. But when you start looking at the legal records and you start seeing Robert Yount, who works for J.H Phipps, and he's bailing guys out when they get drunk and disorderly, or if they, cause problems in the church, or you see J.H Phipps is bailing somebody out. You start seeing these names that are connected with the company. They're building some goodwill. they're involved in their community. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yeah.
I had one other question about sourcing, because I don't know, I've never seen it. Is there any correspondence between Roberta Fulbright and Phipps? Is there any like personal reflection, or is it just from her memoir?
It's mostly from her memoir and then what she publishes in the newspaper. And I may be biased where Roberta's concerned, because I've read some stuff and done some research at Shiloh for other people. And it's not always been positive where Roberta's concerned. So I will acknowledge my own biases here and now, and admit them freely, because I realize that can get in the way of your research. But I haven't found it yet. There's a handful of documentation in there about like kind of what's going on, but there's not any, no letters or anything back and forth.
There's a Wisconsin company.
Right. Ozark Timber Company. They're actually Wisconsin.
Might have simply is a company in the community that's unusual rather than conducted in a different manner in the Ozarks than Louisiana.
I'm sorry.
That what's different is not the part of Ozarks, it's simply a similar.
Yeah, and Phipps seems to be in charge of most, like even what they own, even if it's not Phipps's name on it. Even some of these guys that are connected, like Jeter has his own sawmill, but obviously Jeter's connected. Yount has his own sawmill, but obviously Yount's connected. Like all of these guys in this area have their own sawmills, but they're obviously connected to either Crawford or to Phipps or to Fulbrights in some way. And so, and even the guy who bought the Ozark Timber Company from the guys in Wisconsin are kind of sort of loosely tied to this group of men. So either through the railroad or through the sawmills and stuff. So it's a small community. Everybody knows everybody, and everybody's probably married to somebody's cousin. So.
You should look at Jared Roll's book on the lead mining communities.
I have it. Yeah, yeah, it's on my list. Anything else?
Thank you so much for your presentation.